all the best music is made by DIY, made by outsiders. And Rough Trade organised all this, and they had this thing called the Cartel in the United Kingdom, where all the shops are joined together, distributing these records up and down the country. And it's quite a revolutionary idea. And a lot of the great music, which basically built the foundations of what's become independent music, for better or worse, nowadays, basically comes from the Cartel and Rough Trade. So, ladies and gentlemen, Geoff Travis. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
What I'm really interested in is, where do you come from? Because I've known about it for years. I've known about the shop. Were you a bit of a... Were you kind of like a flower power kind of...
Well, I wasn't really...
hippie?
I was never a hippie. I mean, I went to college, I went to university, and I went there to do philosophy, and I always loved reading, I still love reading. So I went to college, and it was really a student revolution time, although we worked hard at college. But when I finished university and got my degree, I really had no idea what I was going to do. I remember being in a complete state of panic, actually, standing there in the college wondering what the hell am I going to do. And I remember that I'd seen a Laurel and Hardy film which was about the French Foreign Legion. I thought maybe I should join the Foreign Legion. Honestly, that was how clueless I was about what my future career was going to be. And in the end, what I decided to do was, part of my future was in the hands of a really stupid book that you may have heard called The Diceman by Luke Reinhardt. It's a very dangerous book, and one of the things
it's a fantastic book.
Yeah. One of the things about the book is that you can play this game where you roll a dice, and whichever way the dice comes up, then the decision that you're thinking about making is influenced by it. So it's a bit of a... It's one of those...
Is that how you started the shop then?
So what happened was, I was waiting at the bus stop, and I thought, well, I'm teaching in this girls' school, and I like the kids, there's some great people there, but I don't like the other teachers. What am I doing? And I rolled the dice in my head, really, and I was waiting at the bus stop, and I said, if the bus doesn't come to take me to school in the next 5 minutes, then I'm going to leave. And the bus didn't come, and the next day I was on a plane to Montreal to see an old girlfriend. And then I went to Montreal, stayed there, went to Toronto, and worked in a health food store for a while. Met a lovely girl in Toronto. We went down to Chicago, spent some time in Chicago, and then we hitchhiked from Chicago to San Francisco to see City Lights Bookshop.
Ah, so you actually had seen it.
I'd seen it. It was a kind of a little bit of a pilgrimage to go and see that, and to see where Lenny Bruce used to live across the road.
And from that, like you said, you got the inspiration to...
And what happened was, along the way, John, I was then hopelessly addicted, even then, to buying records. And when hitchhiking across America, we'd go through these little towns, and in these little towns there'd be these fantastic Salvation Army stores. And in these stores, you could find records like New York Doll's first album, which nobody wanted, like Tim Buckley Lorca album or Tim Buckley Star Sailor album. They're about 30 cents each. By the time I got to San Francisco, I had a stack of records about that big. And somebody said to me, well, what are you going to do with those records, Geoff? And I said, I really don't know. And they said, well, why don't you ship them back to London and start a record store? And I thought that was a really good idea, and that's exactly what I did. And the inspiration for the Rough Trade shop was really City Lights Bookshop in San Francisco.
Oh, it's an amazing shop.
Which is Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who's a kind of minor American beat poet, but still very, very good. And he opened a shop in San Francisco, and he's got novels and literature and all kinds of things upstairs. And then downstairs you go downstairs, and in the basement there's poetry, and you can sit and drink coffee and read poetry all day, and no one tells you to leave. And in a way, that was the model for the Rough Trade shop. And I thought, well, what I want to do is have a record shop that's going to be like City Lights. It's going to be a place where people can come, and it's not going to have a bright lights like a Wimpy or a McDonald's where you feel like you can only stay for 24 seconds. It can be somewhere comfortable, and maybe you'll meet some other people, maybe there'll be some interchange, maybe there'll be some kind of something going on there which is more than just a place where people have to buy things. And that was the basic idea of it. And that started literally about 3 or 4 months before punk began.
But at that time, like, Rough Trade was very important. In this kind of people meeting, like a catalyst, really.
It was, and people were drawn. I mean, the thing was, the shop, it wasn't on Portobello Road, which is a kind of place where people would go at the weekends. It was on the road behind Portobello Road, because we couldn't afford the rent on Portobello Road. It was way too much. So we were on a side street, and so nobody ever walked past. So there was quite a long period of time when the shop was pretty empty, but it kind of gathered pace with word of mouth, and that worked in our advantage in the end. And then after the shop, really the shop became a very important sort of entry point for for independent music, because one of the things that we did in the shop was track down the most interesting and the first independent records that were being made. For example, Perubu had just released their first 3 singles in Cleveland, and I would write off to Crocus Behemoth, as he was called then, David Thomas, and say, we love your record, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, can we buy some for our shop? And we'd write to Terry Ork in New York, in the Village, and say, we've just heard this amazing record you've put out. It's called Little Johnny Jewel by Television, and can we buy 400 copies? And these people would be so amazed that we knew about them and that we'd actually want to purchase them.
Where did you hear about them? Is it because of
read
John
about
Peel?
them, read about them in fanzines, read about them in New York Rocker, read about them in, you know, there wasn't the internet then. Nowadays you'd hear about, imagine how quickly you'd hear about Television in New York. You'd hear about them in about 5 seconds, but then it took a little bit longer, and it was part of the fun, you know, tracking down things that are great is part of the fun of enjoying culture, really. And although the internet makes it easy, it's still, I think for people that love music, it's still the same experience when you find something that you love and that's yours.
So you really were devouring culture. You were reading everything, listening to everything.
Yeah.
Were you going out to everything as well?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. Go out to gigs all day long. And so it was the beginning of Elvis Costello and Graham Parker and Dr. Feelgood. And the 101ers, which was Joe Strummer's first band, would be playing in the pub around the corner. And these people would all come into the shop and we'd kind of get to know them a little bit. So, and then as punk began, you began to see people, you know, the Kings Road punks aping Ramones or aping the Sex Pistols. And Steve Jones from the Sex Pistols would always come in with loads of records that he'd stolen from somewhere and sell them to us. So we got, and you know, Mick Jones lived up the road in his grandmother's flat on the West Way. So these characters would become known to us. And you know, one of the first things that put the shop on the map was that we had an install with the Ramones. We were asked to have the Ramones down to the shop, and you can imagine we were really excited about that. Because the first Ramones album, as everyone knows, was one of the landmark records.
Yeah. And
they came to the shop, and it was fantastic. It was absolutely mobbed. And they had a great time. They signed autographs, and we made them some tea and bought some records. And then Sire Records said, well, that went really well. We want to do another install with you. And they said, can we do one with the Talking Heads? And we imported Love Comes to Building, which was the first Talking Heads single. And we were thrilled at the idea of having the Talking Heads come to see us in the shop. But this time, it was too early, and no one came. And so Tina and David and everybody walked in the shop, and there was no people, there was no autographs to sign, there was nothing for them to do, but they were really happy, not being the most sort of promotional orientated human beings on the planet, and they were lovely. So the shop became kind of famous for being that. And then really the kind of eureka moment was what you alluded to earlier in your opening when you talked about the Cartel. One of the things that I had learned, and that other people that were working with me at the time, Richard Scott in particular, had learned, was that, you know, as we all know, the people that control the news, you know, what you see on TV, what's available in your bookshops, what's available in the newsagents, all these things, there's an element of control. And what we realized from reading our politics and our history, one of the things that Marx had said was about the control of distribution. If you control distribution, then it gives you a huge amount of power. And the idea that we had was that we would set up our own distribution system, which would challenge the mainstream distribution system, and set up a network around the country, which grew out of the shops around the country that liked the same kind of music as us. So when we would buy, let's say, 400 copies of Little Johnny Jewel, then Bristol, Lloyd and Revolver in Bristol would ring up and say, you've got this record in, and we'd sell him 20. And Jeff Davison would ring up, and he'd ask the same question, we'd sell him, and Bob Last up in Edinburgh, and Tony Kay up in Red Rhino. So, and Pete and Small Wonder, which was another part of London, who put out the first Cure single. These would be our people, if you like, who were on the same wavelength, who liked the same kind of music, who were interested in the same kind of culture. And that became the Cartel, which was a distribution network. And the point of that was to be able to sell on a nationwide basis, and for it not to be all centralized in London. A place where you could, let's say you were a musician in York, say you're the wedding present, you could be David Gedge, and you could walk into Red Rhino and give your demo or your record that you'd made yourself to the guys behind the counter, the girls behind the counter. And if they liked it, they'd buy it from you, and you'd be plugged into a national network. And that meant that, you know, Mute Records and Factory Records and Creation Records and 4AD Records could plug into the system that we'd built and be able to give the musicians that were working with them success. And there was a kind of period there for a few years where the Cartel was really, it was very vital in the sense that it was distributing and selling an amazing amount of great music that was happening in the UK.
Really key, I think, in the post-punk period. I think it really, along with John Peel on the radio and the music papers, the Cartel, to me, is at the core of the triangle. They've got this really interesting music out. You know, these groups, at the time, are small groups, have become legends and highly influential 20, 30 years later. Only have their little window of existence because of stuff like the Cartel.
Well, I think that's true, and I think, you know, one of the things that tickles me always is the kind of a moment when Rob Gretton, when Tony Wilson, when, you know, Joy Division were thinking about what they were going to do. Ian Curtis wanted to be on RCA because his heroes, David Bowie and Iggy Pop, were on RCA. But Tony Wilson didn't really have yet, it was early days, he didn't really have a vision of how he could have an independent record label, but it was Rob Gretton, who was the manager of Joy Division, dear old Rob, who I think turned to Tony one day and said, you know what, why don't we just press our own record and we'll get Rough Trade to distribute it. And that was really the beginning of Factory Records. Otherwise, it could so easily have been that they would have been managers and signed Joy Division to RCA, and the story would have been very different. So I think having the structure there, and it's true for any enterprise that anyone's involved in. I mean, people who make films, you know, you need a circuit of cinemas that are going to be willing to show the work that you're doing. And it's vital to nurturing culture that there's something that exists outside the mainstream that can become the mainstream, but doesn't change itself, soften itself, lose its defining characteristics to appeal to a wider audience. And that was what we worked for a lot of years to build that, and we were very proud of the fact that it was working. But it all grew, it was too successful. It grew too big, and it became a giant, huge behemoth. And we were just music fans, and we were completely, I mean, like most British people, totally inept at managing anything.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks for that. Thanks for your time, and thanks to Geoff.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.